All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAM. Welcome to another edition of our Heart to Heart series. Today's topic is race in the criminal justice system. It couldn't be more timely. And, it's in the news, particularly since the murder of George Floyd. But for a lot of Americans, this has been a top concern for many years. And one thing that, if you know me, a pet peeve of mine is in discussions about important topics, I think the sides tend to talk past one another instead of trying to educate. And so I think this issue is one where when we talk about systemic racism in the criminal justice system, there are those for whom this is a no-brainer, who say the system is racist from top to bottom, always has been. And then there's others who look for numbers and disparity and they say, well, that's not proof of discrimination. And if you're talking about racism, show me the racist actors that you're talking about. I want to point to that. And I think there's a lot of talking past each other. And I think even with the data and evidence that are cited on both sides, there's not a lot of effort to find common ground and truly educate about the problems in this system. And I have said, as somebody who went to federal prison, that speaking just on my own behalf, I just know that I benefited at each step of the process from being white. That didn't mean that I thought I was treated great. I didn't think that my jury selection was fantastic. I didn't think my sentence was great. My prison experience wasn't lovely and enjoyable. But I know it could have been worse at each step too, had I not been white. And so that's just a reality I live with, and whether I can quantify that for people or not, it may be the case that I can't. But what we have here today are just three fantastic guests, and not only are they individually just awesome, but together they have seen the system from different angles. So I'll just briefly introduce Representative Joanna Mcclinton from the great state of Pennsylvania. It represents the 191st district, and she's also the Democratic Caucus chair. Before she was an elected member of the Pennsylvania House, she was a public defender. So she has seen the system from a couple different angles. Melba Pearson is now a candidate for state attorney in one of the largest districts in the country, in Miami-Dade County. She's in the middle of a race right now, and she had been a prosecutor, assistant prosecutor in that office for many years. And she also worked at the ACLU. So she has seen it from the standpoint of prosecution. And Judge Kevin Sharp was a federal judge in Tennessee who served a number of years and ultimately retired after, I'll let him talk more about this, but handing down sentences that he thought were completely unjust, and that he did not have the discretion. He did not feel like he was administering justice. He felt like he was being forced to just execute the will of lawmakers who knew nothing about the people standing before him that he was supposed to sentence. And so we have this great view of the system from different standpoints. And I want to start a little bit with the history, because I think one thing that when we have these discussions, people are looking at a system and they're saying, where's the discriminatory policies and where's the disparity? And I think one thing to do to get everybody away from being defensive is that when we talk about systemic discrimination or racism in the system, you can have that because of forces, a confluence of forces. Some are just system actors who act in a discriminatory fashion. That's the easiest, to point out the police officer or the judge who acts in a racist manner. But we also know that there are biases and heuristics we each have that contribute to that. There are tons of studies that show that a darker skin toned defendant gets a longer sentence or is more likely to be arrested. Those are biases that are not so obvious to see unless they're studied. Then there's things within the system, in the criminal justice system itself, where bias and racism exist. And those make things that are also not intentional. In addition to things like poll taxes, you look at like the crack powder disparity with cocaine sentencing, which was passed because people thought crack was more dangerous at a time. But to preserve that disparity meant people had to ignore the clear racial bias that existed. We see that in school zone laws, something I expect Judge Sharp to talk about too. And then there's things that are upstream of the criminal justice system, right? There's a foundation in this country of inequality that leads to results that we then see disparities in the criminal justice system. So when you have things like redlining or enforced extreme poverty in certain communities, and then a higher violent crime rate in that, that doesn't exist sort of in the state of nature without government policies that contributed to that. And so I think what happens is, for those of us, especially who are white, who try to tease these out and avoid the charge of racism, we're trying to explain these things away. Whereas for other communities, they're not so concerned with pointing out which of those three buckets it comes from. They just know the result of that is disparity in the system. And so I really want to have that discussion, because I think it's important that instead of everybody retreating to their talking points, we try to get to that middle ground of explain why these things exist and how they appear in ways that people may not even know. And so I'm going to start with Representative Mcclinton, not only because she's one of my favorite representatives in Pennsylvania and a leader on criminal justice reform, but she's had both of these seats. And I also know that you're in the position of somebody representing a district that is concerned about violent crime. And so this is an academic to you. You can't just say, oh, I'm worried about disparities, or I'm, or other things, and not also be worried about public safety. And so you have to find that way of addressing crime, but in a way that is fair and that builds trust in the community that is trying to, that you're trying to help. And so can you talk about, both as your public defender experience and your state representative experience, the ways you see race and racism manifest itself in the system? And
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
And thank you, Kevin, and to all of those great folks at FAM for inviting me and assembling this wonderful panel. But most importantly, we appreciate your advocacy all of the time in state capitals, in the federal capital, making sure that the policies that are enacted do not adversely affect people. And we can start just with the idea of mandatory minimums. So my first encounter with them was as an assistant public defender. And in that role here in Philly, I would have judges say, well, Ms. Mcclinton, you made a great argument, and that was an excellent point. And you had the witness contradicted on X, Y, and Z, but the verdict came back guilty, and the legislature said, I have to send Miss So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so to jail for X number of years, no matter what you can tell me about the children they're raising, the job they're currently working, the treatment program they might be in attendance. None of that will matter, because I must sentence this person to 3 to 6 years or to 5 to 10 years or whatever it was. And that was very frustrating as a trial attorney, because you go to court with the goal of being able to minimize your client's exposure to punishment, to jail. I mean, let's be honest. You don't want anyone that you care about to go to prison. And certainly as their advocate sitting right next to them, your job is to make sure that it's the best outcome for your client. Fast forward, I find myself in the state legislature now, where I can vote against mandatory minimums and share stories like I just shared on the floor of the House, where unfortunately, over and over again, these same bad policies have been introduced and sometimes passing in Harrisburg, but we're able at this point to speak from a different level and be able to share these experiences while also saying, I live in Southwest Philly. I want to be safe, just like my neighbor next door on the other side of this wall, and on the other side of my breezeway, there's another house. We want to be safe. We don't want to be shot at. We don't want to be robbed. We don't want any of these horrible things that unfortunately happen many times in areas that have lower income problems and quality of life issues to occur. And now we go to the point of wanting to be safe. And does that also mean criminal justice reform? To me, Kevin, it does. Criminal justice reform is a fair, balanced system where when our children find themselves in the seat that my clients used to sit in when I was their lawyer, that they have a fair shot. But at the same time, what's happening from the attorney's office, the district attorneys, is that they're not throwing the book at people that don't deserve it. That's what's key. When we see someone has violent tendencies, and not just tendencies, but is inflicting violence, we are dealing with the highest numbers of murders and shootings in the city of Philadelphia than we've seen in more than 10 years. So guess what? There are people who are walking around right now that need to go to jail. They just need to go because they don't want to live within the confines of us all living out here peacefully. They don't want to live that way. But at the same time, the people who are not committing those types of violent crimes, they should not be going to jail for long periods of time. That is not what should happen. They should have the opportunity for redemption, and they should also be able to make sure that they're not stained with a record that prevents them from living a life after either making a mistake or the system making a mistake and figuring out whether or not they're guilty or innocent.
All right. Well, this is why I love this panel so much, is because, all right, Melba, defend prosecutors. Why are you sending so many people away with these why are you using these harsh laws to send so many people away?
So I think it's a mixed bag here, right? So first off, the same issue that the representative was talking about applies to us. So these are laws that are in effect, and sometimes prosecutors have the discretion or the ability to be able to waive some of these minimum mandatories, but sometimes there isn't a structure to be able to do so. So that's problem number one. So it's about creating an environment within the prosecutor's office to give more discretion to the individual line prosecutors when it comes to waiving some of these minimum mandatories until there is a legislative option. But between now and then, we have to be able to waive these minimum mandatories. And also some of it has to do with training, because think of it this way. I was a prosecutor here in Miami-Dade County, served for 16 years. And I came to Miami from New York. And I led, a daughter of immigrants, kind of a more conservative upbringing. And there are a lot of things I was not exposed to until I moved to Miami and until I became a prosecutor. So being an African-American woman, there's certain things you pick up very quickly, and there's some commonalities, and, there's that shared experience of racism. So Black prosecutors, I think, are a little bit more attuned to some of these issues. But the vast majority of folks, again, not their fault. If you come from a wealthy background, you may not be aware of some of these basic issues. And when a defense attorney brings you mitigation saying the client grew up poor and they had early childhood trauma and all of these things, it just seems to them like an excuse as opposed to true mitigation that they need to act on. So there needs to be a narrative shift to say, listen, these environmental factors cause issues, and it's a matter of equity and equality, right? Like Kevin, when you mentioned in your opening comments, you were talking about which bucket some of these things fall into. Is it bad policy from redlining? And if you don't understand history, you don't understand how that means you're crammed into a certain community with limited resources. And then, if you grow up in a certain way, there's only a few options available to you to be able to make money, and you may fall into a life of crime for survival reasons, right? So all of these things need to be imparted to prosecutors so that they can make better decisions, because I firmly believe that the majority of the prosecutors go into this job wanting to do the right thing. The majority. There's going to be your few that not so much, but you can unwittingly uphold structures of white supremacy if you don't have the right information. So it's about shifting the narrative, shifting the training, and making sure that we are fighting for equity and making sure that everyone is being treated equally and with respect, as opposed to, did a fancy lawyer come in with a $5,000 suit versus not listening to the public defender, all of those things.
Yeah, well, that point you made about the intention of the prosecutor, they may all be great actors, and people feel the same way sometimes. We hear this about police, and I think what's so important about separation of powers is that we shouldn't trust any system actor on their own. The whole point of checks and balances is because I think when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I think prosecutors, even if they start off with the best of intentions, after being in a culture where they're rewarded and elevated for getting convictions, getting long sentences, if that culture takes root, they're going to become, good people are going to do bad things. So this is where I bring in Judge Sharp, because this is why for many reasons, I'm opposed to mandatory sentences as one example of this problem, but it's because you're taking this important critical system actor, the judge, who in every other case is supposed to weigh individual facts and circumstances, and you're taking away their independent judgment. So we're losing that. I don't want to make you just go that narrowly, though. So I want you to ask, I just want you to just start with your opening about the view from the bench of disparity, discrimination, racism, systemic problems as you saw them from the federal bench, which most people don't get the chance to do.
Right. Well, thank you, Kevin. I wish there was something in your description of me earlier. You said I retired. I wish I had retired because I would then be paid for life.
Oh,
Instead,
sorry.
I stepped down before I got there because of these issues that we're talking about. I came to this job from a civil practice and didn't have much experience with the criminal side. But it's back to this mandatory minimum. What happened was that I was so disturbed by what I was doing and what the system was requiring me to do that it became this question of, am I more useful to society on the bench or off the bench? And for a number of reasons, I decided that it was off the bench in spite of a lifetime appointment. You touched on this, that, part of what happens, particularly in the federal system, more than any other, it's a presidential appointment. So I am vetted by the White House. They go through all of the checks. The Department of Justice goes through all of their vetting and investigating. The FBI does their investigation. The ABA does their vetting and investigation. And then you go over to the Senate, and the Senate Judiciary Committee will do it all over again, using their own investigators, all really for one purpose. And that is, do we have somebody that we trust to put in such a powerful position to use their discretion and judgment to make these decisions? We found one. It's going to be Kevin Sharp. Here you go. Oh, by the way, you don't really have that discretion. It's not that discretion isn't there. There will be discretion used, but it's actually going to be the prosecutor's discretion and not yours. And so then all of that gets taken away from you. And I've said this before. I don't know, Kevin, if we've ever talked about it, but there's a scene from Apocalypse Now where Martin Sheen's character is in there talking to Brando's character, and Brando says, "Are you an assassin?" Sheen, for those of you who don't know, it's the Heart of Darkness set in Vietnam, and Martin Sheen's character has been sent to assassinate Marlon Brando's character, and Brando says, "Are you an assassin?" Sheen says, "I'm a soldier," and Brando says, "You're neither. You're an errand boy sent by a grocer to collect a bill." And I started feeling like, well, wait a minute. For all of these things that I thought I was doing something important, I'm really just an errand boy sent by the legislature to deliver a message that sometimes we are just going to tell you that it's life in prison, that it's 15 years. And I saw those kind of sentences that I was forced to hand down and said, this is not productive. We're not making anybody safer. We are not rehabilitating anyone. That was never the point. There was one gentleman that I was forced to give a 15-year mandatory minimum to. He was 27 years old for being a felon in possession. He did have a pistol under the seat of his car. He was pulled over for what arguably could have been driving while black, but he gets pulled over. They search his car. He's got an unloaded pistol in the front seat. But now you've taken a 27-year-old productive citizen who's taking care of his family, who's got a job, who's doing all these things that we wanted him to do since he was initially convicted as a 17-year-old, has now turned his life around. And you're asking me to take all of that away. Now what's going to happen is we're going to put a 40-year-old back out on the street who likely will have lost his family. He certainly will have lost his job, and he's not gaining a whole bunch of skills while he's in there. And so now what? Are we safer for that? No. And it was very frustrating. I sent 3 gentlemen to life in prison for being low-level members of a drug conspiracy. Who's safer for that? This one of them was 23 years old. Now he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was something that I was not willing to do. But so those were the kind of things that drove me nuts. But it's complicated. Right? The system, the question of racism within the system, it exists. But I also saw many times when I'm looking through, we had pre-sentence reports, right? Before I sentence anyone, I get their history in the form of this document. And I would start reading from the beginning, and you can tell before I know one way or the other what's their race. I get the story of their childhood, and you know how the story is going to end. When they only have one parent, and that parent may be a drug have their own drug issues. You know, when you see that there's no education there, there's no family support, there's no community support, right? While this thing's going through the story of their life, starting at birth, you know, by the time they get to be 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, you go, well, of course, we see what's about to happen here. Someone mentioned earlier about the opportunities. You know, one of the things that I ran into, and it was at a hearing. Well, one time, whenever I would take someone's guilty plea, you're asking them questions to make sure they're competent. And one of the questions that I would ask would be, what's your employment? What have you been doing just since high school? Tell me that. And the answer usually was selling drugs. And I would say, well, wait, that's not really employment. That's criminal activity. But to them, that was their job. And I heard that over and over again. But when I would ask them about non-criminal activity, the answer would be nothing. I've not held a job. And they may be in their 30s or 40s and have never worked in a legitimate job. And so you've got to tackle all those problems. A lot of those problems end up coming back to issues of poverty, and those end up coming back to issues of race. And so trying to untangle all of that to make the system less racist is really difficult. And that's what's going to make people's heads hurt. You know, I listen to everybody talk here and you go, yes, 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 all of those are right. Now what? Now, how do we solve that problem?
Yeah, I want to jump in there because I feel the same way. And I also feel like, you know, the criminal justice system has responsibility not to exacerbate those disparities and those lack of opportunities. It's not always the best system to fix them, right? Because at that point, you may be sentencing a 40-year-old person. And at that point, you know, your choices are to send them to prison. You know, you don't have the ability at that point to say, I decree you to have a great educational background and job history. You don't, and it's too late. And so it seems like even this debate over the police, it's got to be not either or, it's got to be both, right? We need trust from the police, but we also need to put those structures in place because we can't just do without law enforcement and then think that the early childhood education, all these things are going to take root overnight. I want to ask you, Representative Mcclinton.
Sorry, but one last thing though, but if you wait until that point, you have lost them. I mean, you just made a great point there. If we're not dealing with it until they're 30, 40 years old,
right?
Well, how are we supposed to deal with that? Which means you've got to reallocate resources and you've got to catch people when there are opportunities for them. If someone comes walking into my courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and they're 40 years old and they have no employment history to speak of, well, what am I supposed to do? This is, you know, I don't know. And that's, I asked that question, you know, somewhat rhetorically, but it's a real question. What are we as judges supposed to do by that point?
Well, that's what I think. I think so many of those problems are a failure upstream, right? And
Right.
we've got to tackle that. That's what makes this more complicated than just being a criminal justice issue.
Right. It's a society issue.
Right. And Representative Mcclinton, I want to ask you this because you were talking, and you're talking about gun crime, and we're seeing a spike across the country in a lot of cities, not all of them. And I know you have that in Philadelphia. And you talked about, you know, people who commit serious violent offenses who seem to be an ongoing harm. People who are willing to shoot, you know, are dangerous in most cases, unless it's heat of passion or something. So they have to go to prison. But you also know that the numbers, if you look at who goes to prison for violent crime, is going to create disparity. And so how do you square those, right? I mean, somebody's going to look at the system and say, you know, the disparity in our prison population between the general population and our prison population is skewed. There's more Black people in prison, than white, even as a percentage of population. And we can talk about the societal issues, but how do you get away from that now? How do you address that disparity when the crimes are serious enough that you think, and I think Judge Sharp would say, those are crimes that people need to go to prison for? How do we address that?
So what we need to realize first and foremost is that in Pennsylvania, when we look at our prison population and the state correctional institutions, we have the highest number of juvenile lifers without parole than any other state in the country. So you would think that Pennsylvania must at one point have been the most violent place to live because we have all of these juvenile lifers. Additionally, we have so many people languishing who've been sentenced to the death penalty. And that is a hot issue depending on who you ask and what has happened to them personally or what their deep personal beliefs are that they hold. Sometimes rooted in faith, other times rooted in their perspectives. So I think that we need to take off of the table the death penalty, number one. I think we also need to take off of the table life without parole, number two. I have been inside of so many institutions, of course, as a public defender, but since I've been in the legislature, and I meet with people who have spent 65 years in jail, 55 years in jail, 45 years in jail. And the things that they are saying to me are not the way they were thinking at the time of the incident that brought them into that space. So at some point, we have to say, if we want to fairly fund our schools, then we need to realize that we cannot afford to pay for people to be housed who are no longer posing a threat to any of us. And I don't mean 10 years, 20 years, because I have to be very honest when I go to Montgomery County at what used to be Greater Fort and is now Phoenix. And they say, well, Rep, give us a number. First of all, we cannot do that. We have to involve the people who are victimized. We have to get feedback. We have to talk to them. We have to be sensitive to the loss that they've suffered that will never, ever, ever be made whole again. We can't just, choose a number and say people should get out at this number. And we also need to figure out a way that with our lengthy commutation process, that it doesn't require a unanimous vote. I have a bill on that right now so that it goes, instead of 5 votes needed, that it will go to 3 out of 5. Because of those 5, there are 2 elected officials. And whether or not anyone will say it before me, I'll tell everyone this. Elected officials are concerned with voting records, whether it's voting on legislation or whether that's voting on something like the parole board on who gets out of jail. So we have to look at the onset, the fact that we have all these people languishing. And then when we talk about reallocation, we need to fund our schools fairly. We also are leading this nation in having inequitable education funding, meaning what the state gives to school districts is not fair. And we're squarely dependent across the state, across the 67 counties on property taxes. So where I live in this wonderful twin home in Southwest Philly, my property taxes, thank God, are not very high. But as a result, the elementary school that I can see when I go outside is not getting enough money because we in the state capitol are choosing to spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to house men in their 80s. Someone explain that to me and how that could work. So those are things that we could do legislatively and policy-wise to help, bring that balance down so that it is not as racist as we've seen it be. Looking at the people who've already been impacted that are literally languishing and need to have the opportunity to come home and perhaps be a role model to some of the youth today who have very little down in here that gives them the propensity and the boldness to say, I'm going to shoot, I'm going to kill, I'm going to shoot this woman in the head that's pregnant or whatever it is. We don't know what we're missing as a society when we have this many people who've been taken from us for so long.
I'm just going to give Celeste Trusty, our Pennsylvania State Rep, a couple minutes to jump up and down and cheer that answer because she's 100% on board with that and pushing to support your bill on clemency reform and also to get rid of life without parole. And we agree with you. Now, I think part of what you're saying there, though, is in response to an argument about racial disparity, that these extreme sentences are where we see it a lot, right? And so those are things aren't making us fair. But you're also, tell me if I'm wrong, you're also saying that in some of these instances, public safety demands prison time for people who are willing to shoot and do these things. But I want to talk about, you have an effort, on drug crime, we talk about there's other interventions that could work maybe better. If somebody's addicted, it might be drug treatment or something else. We're learning more about anti-violence programs that don't rely just on prison or that try to, interrupt violence before it happens through, people on the street, trusted messengers, credible messengers, things like that. I know you've supported some grant programs in your district to try to get at that. Can you talk about a little bit that, so people who don't think that okay, yeah, nonviolent, I'm okay with some of those people getting out, but violent, it's, throw away the key on these people versus other solutions that may actually stop the violence from happening versus just punishing it when it does.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Celeste, for all your advocacy. It's tireless, it's passionate, but most importantly, it's effective. Without your voice and all the organizing you do, my voice would not be as relevant. So thank you. But in terms of the intervention, so when I'm not wearing my attorney hat, state rep hat, law professor hat, I'm also a minister. And I preached a sermon when we had a really bloody summer recently called Interrupt, Intervene. And I think that as you look at what's worked in other cities, it's not something I've come up with, but just creating the concept here for people in their mind is we can intervene before many of these things happen. And when you say intervene, it's not by having uniformed officers at every scene, in every corner, and every intersection, because that just means, when they take a sip of coffee or look the other way, I'm still going to shoot. I mean by intervene, finding out what the needs are in young people's lives and being able to connect them so that when they get in front of, Judge Sharp, they're not saying I didn't do anything but be a drug dealer since I was in middle school and I dropped out of high school or whatever it might be. And there's a group violence intervention program that was here in Philadelphia a few years ago and was very effective in bringing our numbers down because it connected people who were either targets to being shot at or likely to shoot someone else with resources that they needed, and most importantly, with a way out. So many times, maybe it's a police show on TV or a show about, drug dealers on another channel. We always think, oh, people want to do wrong and choose wrong behavior and make bad decisions and put themselves and other people around them at danger. Well, a light bulb. Everybody does not want to do that. And I believe it was our DA, Melba, sharing that some people end up falling into those few options and choosing the worst one. So thanks to my colleague who's retired now, State Rep Movita Johnson-Harrell, we have a $500,000 grant that will be coming specifically to West Philly, where we have seen out of control numbers, West and Southwest Philly, to do group violence intervention. We've been working with many folks on this. It's not myself alone. My colleague, Representative Morgan Cephas, along with the whip in the House, Jordan Harris. In addition, our district attorney, Larry Krasner, and of course, Mayor Jim Kinney and Police Commissioner Outlaw. Like all of these collaborations are happening, and it's going to be rolled out here in July. And we're going to be doing, for my neighbors who are watching, a town hall within the next 2 weeks with our council member where I live, Jamie Gaudier, to talk about what it is and to talk about how we can get trusted messengers. Because guess what? When I go to talk to teenagers, I get a lot of different feedback. And this one time I was at an adult facility here in Philly talking to all boys about a lot of different things. They were being charged as adults. And one of them said to me, hey, miss, you've never been a young Black boy. I said, that is the truth. You got me. You got me. I have not. I'm talking about my life, my experience, but that is something I have not. So we need trusted messengers to talk to our youth and to be able to connect to them. I might connect to 2, but if they're 10, we need somebody to come in and be able to get those other 8. So we look forward to bringing community members on, and we know that it's just going to take all of us. It's going to take faith institutions and so much more to be able to see a decline in violence and not to see people unfortunately have to pay consequences that are severe for making these really bad decisions to engage in violence. You're muted, Kevin.
There you go. I'm off now. Yeah, thank you. Usually I have to tell guests that, but thank you. Usually we wait until the other side proposes mandatory minimums to say, oh, no, we care about violence too, and here's our solutions. And so that's why I think it's so important to go forward and be on the offense to say, we care about safety in our communities too, but we have different solutions instead of just locking everybody up. Melba, I want to go to you because one piece of this puzzle, and again, this is complicated too, is representation. And what Representative Mcclinton said is right. A lot of times people say, they got to see themselves in the person, or the person may have a different life experience that gives them more empathy or understanding of what somebody's going through. And I always think of this myself when I used to be tough on crime and people would say, well, you didn't choose that path. I mean, I was a lemming. I just did what my friends did and what my parents did, right? Like, so I played Little League football and baseball because that's what I did. I didn't have a parent selling drugs and another one in prison. I had opportunities. So it wasn't that I was some morally courageous person who made good choices. I just did, I just did what everybody else did. And I just grew up in a different place. And so I do think having those different life experiences helps, but it's not everything, right? Because then you see, look, Judge Sharp is probably as empathetic as you can be as a judge, really scouring the record as a white male. You have Jackie Lacey, who's the prosecutor out in Los Angeles County, who's being opposed by Black Lives Matter because she spent 40 years locking people up. How do how important is representation? How important though is ideology? And like, what is it that makes somebody aware of all these circumstances? Is there a key or is there no key? I mean, is there, because I'm thinking about as somebody who you winning the office that you're seeking now, will bring a different perspective from your life experiences. It's not just the color of your skin, it's your life experiences. And it will also you'll be a role model to others, and people will see you in a way that says, I want to live a life like that. And so, how do you think about that?
So I firmly believe that ideological beliefs are very important, but I think representation is critical because at the end of the day, perception is reality. And I think of the best example is there was a Black judge, and I'm trying to remember if it was Judge Bernice Donnell or if it was Judge Phyllis Cote, one of the two. It may have been Judge Cote, where she was a Black judge. She, got on the bench and she started hiring her staff. So she hired a Black clerk, and her bailiff was Black, and all of her courtroom staff were Black, right? And so she had her courtroom, it was all good. A white defendant came in, and he looked around, and he's like, "Judge, I'm going to need a reset." And judge is like, "Okay, sure, fine, no problem," right? And then the person leaves, and the man comes back at the next reset date with a Black lawyer. And so the judge was like, "Well, what was wrong with Mr. So-and-so? He's very experienced. I've known him for years." And he basically was just like, "Ma'am, I looked around and saw what time it is," right? So he felt that the only way he was going to get access to true justice in that courtroom was by bringing in a Black attorney. Right? So think of it in the reverse. When you have a situation, and by the way, this was Judge Donnell. So let me just correct that. Judge Donnell, who is a federal judge out of Tennessee, amazing woman. If you ever get the chance to read anything done by her, and she's been a leader in the American Bar Association. Anyway, when you think of that in reverse, and you think about the Black defendant that walks into a courtroom and looks around, and the judge is white, his public defender is white, the prosecutor is white, all the staff is white, and he's sitting there like, "Am I going to get a fair shot here?" When you compound that with the level of disparities within the criminal justice system and just sort of the historical perspective, you're not going to be in a situation where you're going to have a lot of faith in the system. So that's why I say representation is very, very important. It cannot be ignored. And I think also it's not just about representation, it's making sure that diverse people have a seat at the table when it comes to setting policy. Because it's one thing to say, okay, I've got a bunch of diverse line prosecutors, but when you get to the executive offices, the only Black people you find are the secretaries, right? Or, the administrative assistants. So, you have to really walk the walk. And if you are someone who is not, you're a white person that is, all about the movement and making sure that equity and justice is real for everyone, then the way you go about it is being active and intentional in bringing in diverse voices, and that you also go and work in coalition with the community. Because then I think it's almost more incumbent upon you to be like, listen, there's some historical things that I know just because of my life, but there's going to be some gaps for other people kind of coming into the culture to catch up. So it's very important that you seek out the people that hold that historic knowledge of your neighborhood. So for instance, where are some of the historic areas that were critical during the civil rights movement, right? Because then if an action or something happens at that particular area, that could affect the reasons why certain things play out the way they did. So maybe everybody starts a protest at this one particular spot. But knowing that information makes you more sensitive to the community, and then better makes you able to work on policy and center the needs of the community because you know about the community. So it's two things. representation, but also being intentional in learning and wanting to work with the community to find solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Can I add some of that? Here's you're right about that, Melba. Here's what's difficult is because, and you're in this position, politicians rarely get elected and reelected by appearing soft on crime. And so now you're kind of stuck. I got to show them how tough I am. And it matters because if you can disenfranchise a group voting, then they don't really get that representation. And the ones that are represented are the ones in the nicer neighborhoods going, I need you to protect me. You better be tough on crime. And then it kind of snowballs. And, I see a lot of times, we were talking about this earlier, that people, and it's just human nature, well, I'm elected or hired to do a job. And then I start internalizing that. It's no longer just a job. It's now becomes who I am. And so I'm a prosecutor. It gets to be really difficult for me to focus on the justice part of my Department of Justice job. And what I then focus on is the winning part of my Justice Department job, which is getting convictions. And in order to do that, I start buying into that. And I see everybody as a criminal. And let's see how tough we can be. And it's all of those. And I realize I jumped around too on the reasoning behind all of that. But it's so many things that come together. I think
Let me ask about that. Let me ask this because we have some questions in, but it plays into this. Is that for a lot of our families who are watching others, I think that the system gets complicated for them. They're not lawyers, and this is their first entree into the system, and it's like they don't care whose job it is. Just somehow justice is slipping through the cracks between these, and the prosecutor says, well, the legislature passed this law, so I'm supposed to use it this way, and then they go after this harsh sentence, and then the judge says, I agree, it's not justice, but this is what the jury found, and the legislature said that, so I have to do it. And the politician says, well, my constituents want this tough on crime. And so they're like, well, then who's for us? I mean, how do we, who's going to take accountability to say that that's not what we want? And as system actors, like, how do you avoid falling into that trap of becoming calloused? I will say this, we have a question about, do you see the people as individuals? I remember when I was standing trial, and I remember, I didn't testify, so it wasn't until I got to sentencing that I wrote a letter to the judge, and I thought, you don't see me as a 3D person. I mean, the judge is making, plans to do hearings and all this stuff. Okay, well, is this good for the prosecution? Is this good for the defense attorneys? I wasn't even a human in that courtroom. And I just know that a lot of people feel that way. They feel like they're just pawns, and all of a sudden their life is out of their hands with these system actors who forget that there's a life tied to families and stuff there. So how do you, Kevin, even on the bench, and Melba, like, how do you remind yourself, not become callous to the fact that these are people, who have lives? They're not just, cases in front of you.
For me, part of it goes back to, I never saw myself as someone whose importance increased because of the job I got. I was someone who was appointed as a caretaker of a very important position. And I think it was at my swearing in, there was a judge, Todd Campbell, who was the chief at the time, who said, look, the most important thing you are going to do in this job is decide on people's liberty. The rest of it's money. This is people's liberty, and that's where you've got to dig in and not fall into the trap. It's another orange jumpsuit. Let's move them on. Let's move them on. Let's move them on. They're people, and I think that if people may have a different idea of what kind of judge I was, but I think I can safely say that I saw everyone who came through, even the worst of the worst for the people that I saw, as individuals, and they got there for a reason. Now, ultimately, I may have to, sentence them to 20 or 30 years. But I saw them as individuals, and I think it just kind of goes back to recognizing that people are human beings. And I don't know, this is kind of an odd thing, but I think about it sometimes. It was rare at a sentencing that the defendant didn't thank me on the way out of their courtroom, out of my courtroom, no matter what they got, because I always listened to them. I always made sure that this sentence was individualized and fit, and that even if they were disappointed in the sentence they got, that almost all of them thanked me. Chris Young, who I sentenced to life in prison, thanked me on his way out for listening to him and saying, "You're one of the first people who's ever talked to me like a human being." And unfortunately, I had to do that while I was about to sentence him to life in prison. And I thought, well, how sad is this?
Yeah. Representative Clinton, I mean, I know people feel this way even about public defenders. I mean, a lot of us see public defenders as heroic, sticking up for the constitutional rights of the people that society hates the most in many cases, and making sure that their constitutional rights are upheld. But the caseload and such make it hard to probably develop the relationship and seem to be giving each case the care it deserves. Their caseloads are huge. How did you do that? How hard was it to make people feel like, oh yeah, this system is fair? You're getting somebody, somebody competent to represent you in your interest, even though I have 1,000 other clients and, a tough judge and aggressive prosecution. How were you able to sort of make people feel, or did you feel like you were able to make them feel like this was a system where they were going to get treated fairly?
Usually, yes. And because I, was a new, as they say, baby lawyer in our office, a baby lawyer when I started, there's so much you learn about lawyering that takes time. And I don't even mean like in the courtroom. I mean the attorney-client relationship. The way I was interacting with my clients in September of 2006 when I started was not how I was interacting with them in September of 2013. And over time, with different types of clients and different experiences, and of course, numerous times being asked, how old am I? Am I a lawyer? Am I old enough to go to court? Do I know what's going on with their case? When I did, I just started to realize that, one, I had to show them while I was beating them, because they would always say, you're just too nice. You're not going to fight in court. I'm like, I'm going to fight. You wait, I need an audience. I need people in the back room to say, and heavy sighs and gasp. But I learned over time, and I learned it from day one. You start off with respect, giving it, but also if it's not reciprocated, demanding it. Because you are the free lawyer, there is an expectation that you'll be lazy, that you don't know what's going on with the case, that you don't really care, that you do not have a vested interest, so on, so forth, continuously. And for some experiences, the only time I ever had a few judges to have my back was when I was being fired, by a client. Then, oh, Miss Mcclinton is great. She's the best. She's articulate. She'll fight for you. You can't fire her. We're going to trial in 30 minutes. But you also have to be sensitive to the fact that because of all of the other factors we've discussed with systemic racism, you can't take it personally when someone is not respecting you. And I don't mean in a bad situation, but in a way that you think, oh, I deserve you to have trust and faith. People have grown up in systemic racism and deep poverty, gone to schools where there has been little to no investment, been in neighborhoods where some political figures are only about re-elections, we touched on already. So don't take it personally when they're not like, oh, Ms. Mcclinton, you're my savior. Like that takes time. And for some clients, you never get that much time because it's one incident and it's one time and you don't see them ever again for years and years and years. But I do have some that I'm still in touch with, some that still write, some that, think I'm still their lawyer. And I'm like, nope, that's not my role, but I can direct you here. I can send you information. And I just think that the biggest key is to have the confidence in yourself by being prepared. Nobody wants to talk to someone who's unprepared, whether it's your accountant about to do your taxes, is like, oh, did you work last year? It's like, come on now, it's my third time here. I do this job and I'm at this salary level and we should be talking about these deductions. Like you have to be prepared. And just because it's a lot of work doesn't mean you can half step it. I mean, my mom would ask me, are you really working till 10 o'clock? Yes. Like I'm literally going page by page because I'm not going to court the next day to be embarrassed be embarrassed by the cops, by the prosecutor. I'm going to be prepared, even if everything somehow falls apart and gets a date. I am going to know what's going on. And that takes so much energy and so much effort. And because we often have such tough cases, we have the ones that nobody else wants. We have people sometimes, unfortunately, on video. So you also have the experience of not seeing the outcome you earnestly desire. So that was more of a toll than clients not respecting me, quite honestly.
No,
I want to jump in on that because like the rep was completely like talking about my life in the first few years of becoming a prosecutor. I'm like, wait, I recognize that. But one of the things I definitely want to highlight is that we really have to address the issue of caseloads. I know that public defenders around the country have been very successful at filing lawsuits and, saying like, listen, like it is malpractice for me to have this many cases and have to work on them. Because you have to work on them diligently and you need enough time to work on all of them. And there's only so many hours in a day. And I think the same issue applies to prosecutors. So when you talk about the whole treating each individual as a human being, I think about my beginning years as a prosecutor. I treated everyone with respect, but I also had 300 cases. So it was really hard for me to take that holistic approach, which in every case, I did the best that I could, but 300 cases is an insane amount of cases by any metric, right? But then as I evolved in my career and was in a position where I was in specialized units, handling domestic violence cases, handling homicides, eventually becoming a supervisor, I had less cases. So my interaction became extremely different. And I was able to have the time to push victims and witnesses and survivors and make sure that the story is solid, or if there's problems or discrepancies with something that a police officer is doing, I had the time to investigate and then address it and raise the alarm if there are other issues happening. And then also, I had the opportunity, I would actually sit with defendants and rep, please don't have a heart attack. But a lot of times defense attorneys would leave me with their clients alone because they knew I was going to be a straight shooter. I wasn't trying to trick them, but I wanted to explain to them, this is where I'm coming from. This is why I'm offering the plea that I'm offering. And they might be like, well, I'm counter offering this amount, or here's what's going on with my life. And I'm like, all right, listen, we can do this. I just need you to promise me you're going to get your GED, whatever the case may be. And if there's an issue, ask for help. Don't wait till it gets to the point that your probation gets violated or something like that. And so, I think that's the approach that I enjoyed the most, because I was really able to interact and find a solution that was best for everyone, right? As best as possible for the defendant, as best as possible for the survivor or the next of kin. And to me, that's how justice should function.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to ask you this something, because you guys really discouraged me with this one, which is this idea that we're still living in a time where you have to run as tough on crime. A lot of times with our members and our families, they'll say, all the politicians care about is winning re-election. And that to me is an opportunity. That says, then go vote. Tell them you care about criminal justice reform and you're going to vote. And you're not going to ask for the person who just locks them up and throws away the key. So Melba, you're actually in the middle of a race and you're running as a prosecutor. So I don't think you're probably running saying, I'm going to hammer everybody I see, no matter their color. So then do you worry that you're not tough enough? So how do you bridge that?
So actually, my race is a little unique, because even though I'm challenging my old boss and we're both Democrats, there's a quirk in Florida law that allows for this to be an open primary, which means Republicans, Democrats, and no party affiliated folks are all able to vote. So, there's been I've received pushback from people like, the biggest thing is, oh, you were with the ACLU of Florida, you're a socialist, you don't want to free everybody, you want to turn this into New York where there's just like bodies lying in the streets. And I'm like, first of all, I'm from New York, and that's not even accurate what you're saying, and you've never been to New York, so stop. But secondly, there's somewhat of this pressure of, you've got to let people know that you're going to be tough on crime. And I'm like, listen, right? I'm all about being smart on crime, right? Like, it's not about, for me, it's about safer communities in the long run, and prevention is always better than a cure. So if we can do preventative programs, diversionary courts, other things that take people out of the system and address the underlying issues, we're going to have safer communities both now and in the long run, as opposed to you're hoping to incarcerate your way out of a situation. We know it doesn't work. And what's insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So
how do you do it? Sorry, how do you do it in an environment though where one side is being caricatured as no prisons, no police, abolish the police, abolish all prisons, which is not, that's not even the position most people have who even say those things. I mean, how do you keep the debate like, I know what you're saying. You're like, no, I'm not for tough on crime, but I am for smart on crime, which means measurement. So it feels like you got more explaining to do. And then, but you're going to be tagged as, oh, you want to let everybody out. So how do you find that sweet spot?
Well, I'll let you know the punchline on August 18th when my election happens. But, for me, yes, it's a lot more explaining, but I feel like, all right, I'm gonna go there. As an African-American woman in America, as an African-American woman professional, you're always explaining, right? Every time you walk into a space, there's well, what school did you go to? And, where did you grow up? And what are your qualifications? As opposed to my white counterparts where they're like, oh, you have the title, let's go, right? So having to explain a little extra is not abnormal to me. But at the end of the day, I just try to keep pointing people back to, look at my record, look at what I've said, listen to all of my Facebook lives now that we're on quarantine and it's not like we can go out and meet people. So I'm like, I do a lot of social media videos. So I'm like, look at my videos. Have you ever heard me say what you're proposing right now?
Right.
And the answer is generally no. And I'm like, okay, so, so I always try to reframe it back to look at what I've actually said on the issue and don't assume that because somebody else, or you read something somewhere that those views are imputed to me. That's not fair and that's not genuine.
But even what you're saying is complicated, is part of the problem. I mean, I had a school resegregation case and ultimately I ruled against the plaintiff, but the problems were all, economic policy and housing policy and transportation policy. And that just gets complicated. It makes people's heads hurt and they go, can't we just, throw them in jail? It's the same reason, corporations care more about short-term profits than the long-term health. That's not their problem. Your problem is how many convictions can you make in the next 4 years or whatever the term is, so you can get reelected. And that's just a difficulty that's put on you. I like the way you explained it though, of I'm always explaining, right? At least you're used to it. And I have to agree. I don't have to do that. I can walk in and just go, here's what it is. And people go, oh, okay. All right, well, there's the middle-aged white guy. That must be true.
I'm so angry about this because before Celeste was jumping up and down with the agreement, and now I know Rabia is in the background jumping up and down with agreement about having to explain everything. So you guys are really hitting all the buttons with my staff. I could go for another hour, and I know you guys don't have that time. So we're gonna wrap up. I'm gonna ask you to give parting thoughts. We really should do another one of these at some point. But I just want to end on like a higher note, which is, we've created this system and we can change the system. And so there are some numbers that should give us some hope. And part of this was changes to the crack law, for instance, and other things and other reforms that have been passing. But the Council on Criminal Justice did a report that found differences between 2000 and 2016. So only a 16-year period. But for drug crimes, the disparity between black and whites was 15-1. It's dropped to 5-1. 5-1 is terrible, but it's better than 15-1, and that's a 16-year change. Among women, disparity in overall imprisonment, not just drugs, dropped from 6-1 to 2-1. Now, part of the reason it dropped is because white women's imprisonment has gone up for violent crimes and other things. That may not be the way we want to reduce these disparities, but it did. And among men, for all imprisonment, it went from 9-1 to 6-1. Again, a huge gap, but moving in the right direction. And so I think what that indicates is through sort of intentional policymaking and maybe different system actors, there are things that we can do to address these things, because during that period, crime continued to drop. So we didn't sacrifice anything in public safety while we reduced those disparities. So I don't use those to say mission accomplished, but just to say we can do this. And those who say, oh no, if we change disparities, that's going to be because we let some dangerous people out of prison. That hasn't been what's happened. So we're at the time. This one, I just asked people to give some final thoughts. I'll go in the order that we started. Representative Clinton, if you could start. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me. And thank you to our awesome panelists, the judge and our next Miami-Dade state attorney for sharing so much today. And I'll just remind people that we all, just as neighbors, citizens, we have an obligation to speak up and to speak out, to participate in the electoral process. We know it is not perfect. It is flawed. We know that sometimes things seem like they're taking forever, because while you all are talking about 4-year district attorney elections, I'm like, try every 2 years. And then people saying you didn't fix the things that have been wrong for 60 years. It's like, okay, I'm right up on it. I'll be able to do it on Monday. On Monday, I can fix the things that have been wrong for the last 40 years. But that's a side note, a little bending. But quite seriously, you know, speak up, participate in the process, make sure your voice is heard, and that you're choosing people, whether they're going to the state capitol or the United States Capitol, or to be the prosecutor in your city, your town, that they are with the similar thought process you have towards ending mass incarceration. And I don't know how much people can see what my shirt says, but that's all it says many times. Mass incarceration was started at the end of slavery to keep Black and brown people basically enslaved. You'll see the only time there's free labor in the Constitution after slavery is abolished is for punishments of crime. So we put those pieces to the puzzle together and we see what we have today, which is communities that have been forced to be segregated because of redlining, and addition, schools that are just historically underfunded. So when we look at the outcomes, they're not shocking, they're not surprising, but we can work together to combat them and have a better future for the next generation. So thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate you. Melba?
So again, Kevin, Fam, thank you so much for this opportunity. And to my fellow panelists, this was amazing. It really was an honor to have this discussion with all of you. Parting thoughts, vote. Period, end of story, right? I mean, we're mourning the loss of Representative John Lewis. We're mourning the loss of C.T. Vivian. You know, all of these folks laid down their lives, put their body and their safety and their comfort at risk so that we have the opportunity to be able to vote and raise our voices around the change we want to see. And I think too often we give that power away, either by not voting or by not doing our research to make sure that people we are electing are aligned with our values. And that is where the true systemic and prolonged change is going to come from the ballot box. We could protest all day against the murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and so many others whose names we know and don't know. But at the end of the day, protest is a great first step. But we finalize it by making sure that we put people in office who are going to fix legislation, fix what's been wrong for the last 60, 100 years, and then also take a holistic approach, understanding that we need to properly fund our schools. We need to properly fund social services. You know, we need to make sure that caseloads are down for public defenders as well as prosecutors. You know, all of these things take a coordinated approach, and the only way we can really fix it is through voting.
Before I go to Judge Sharp, FAM is C3, I can't comment on the outcome of your race, but I will say, you know, sort of congratulations and good luck to you for putting your hat in the ring, because a lot of people complain about politics and then they don't put their hat in the ring and actually go, and it's not easy. And you endure a lot of attacks, especially I'm sure because of your gender and color. And it's, you know, somebody's got to do it. You know, somebody's got to step in and actually put their hat in the ring. And so good on you for not just sort of, you know, complaining from the sidelines, but saying, I'll try to fix it myself. So congratulations. And Judge Sharp.
Not to pander to FAM, but the quickest fix, as I see, is getting rid of mandatory minimums. These families against mandatory, you've got to get what it ends up doing, and everybody's right, and I said it myself, it's a complicated problem and you've got to attack it from all these angles. But if you want the short term, what can we do in the short term? Get rid of mandatory minimums and treat people as individuals. That's the short term move in the right direction, and that allows the district attorneys, if they are treating people as individuals, to make the decisions that most lead us towards justice. It allows the legislatures to make decisions and pass laws that treat people as individuals. And it allows judges to make individualized decisions regarding punishment, whether that's a prison sentence or whatever it is. Another way, and a short-term way to get there, is you've got to have diversity. The diversities, it's back to this representation issue. Diversity's got to be, you have it more on the public defender side, but you've got to have it in the prosecution side. It can't be a bunch of white guys prosecuting people, and you've really got to have it on the bench. Can't be a bunch of white guys deciding what's going to happen to, mostly folks of a different race. I've said this about juries, and people would have these ideas. Well, I don't want an African-American on there, or I do, or I want my jury full of, I need Hispanics. I've got a Hispanic defendant. I talked to every jury that, except for two, that, were in my courtroom. It never worked that way. You need diversity, not for that reason, because you can tell by the color of their skin what they're going to decide, but because their perspective and their experience brings a whole new level of discussion as to what the answer ought to be. And so that works on juries. It works on the bench. It works in the prosecutor's office. It works in the defender's offices. You've got to do that. So, those are my short-term solutions, and they're all doable. That's the other thing. It's not like, okay, let's fix the education system, which needs to be done. And, in 50 years, I think we're going to get there. No, we can do this tomorrow. You can do this tomorrow, and let's get started. So thank you very much for letting me participate. The other guests here, Representative Mcclinton and Melba, I feel like I just need to be sitting over here taking notes. Wait, what did she say? That seemed right. So thank you for letting me hang out with you guys for a while.
Yeah, no, thanks. I really can't say enough. Awesome panel. Because Judge Sharp mentioned getting involved, I just want to say, if you are not already a member of FAM, please text FAM, F-A-M-M, to 21333 to just get on our list and start getting active. And, the elections are coming up, and the best thing you can do is vote and make sure people know that you care about these issues. So again, awesome panel. Thank you guys so much. And we'll have to have you back. And again, thanks for your time. So we'll see everybody next week on the Heart to Heart series.